Hi, and welcome to Chapter 15. Chapter 15 is on network security, so there's a whole lot to do. Let's get started. First thing to recognize is where are we in the class. As you can see, we're getting down to the bottom. We're working on administration this week. So this week we're going to be covering network security, maintaining your network, troubleshooting your network, and designing and installing your new networks. So this is going to finish up the book prior to your preparation for the exam. When people think of security, the first thing they usually reference is hacking. What is a hacker? Well, a hacker is technically anybody who works with a computer who figures things out by just experimenting with the system. So some people, when they learn a new concept, are going to say, tell me all of the rules. Tell me how it's done. They may want to have someone show them how it's done. Hackers tend to just get their hands on a keyboard and start playing, and they will figure it out as they go along. There's usually no rule book that they really follow, and that's pretty common. So a hacker could be someone who's very kind and generous, and it's not always a bad term. When we refer to hackers, we usually use one of three terms: a white hat, a black hat, or a gray hat. Each one of these types of hackers is technically a hacker or an intruder who is going to try to break into systems. But there's different reasons for it. So a white hat hacker is very ethical and legal. He actually follows the rules. He's the guy that figures out, penetration testing, where the problems are in your network. He does not use any of his information for nefarious reasons. He doesn't break any laws. He goes and talks to the person, I'm going to try to break into your server. And the other person is going to go, okay, I know what's going on. There is no illegality going on. These people are paid very well to come in and figure out what's wrong with your network. A black hat hacker is the other direction. We sometimes call these crackers. They're the ones that actually are using the information to commit crimes, to obtain identity theft, or to obtain company secrets, or to actually break in for the purposes of doing something nefarious. And then there's a gray hat hacker. Generally, they fall within the laws and they follow the rules. However, sometimes they kind of bend the rules a little bit. Sometimes they break them. So they're kind of in that middle range. They're not purely malicious, but they're also not always purely generous. There are a lot of different security breaches that we're going to discuss. I think there's 3 or 4 slides on this. So this is going to discuss different ways that we can handle security breaches, different attacks, and different malware options. So starting with your basic network administration, how do people break into a computer? How do people get in and break that security breaching? Well, we start with the basics. Obviously, authentication. We have to figure out who the user is. Make sure that they're an honest user. They're the good user that we want to come in. So we use authentication protocols to be able to say, are you who you say you are? We're going to talk a little bit more about authentication later in the chapter. We use encryption, which is an algorithm designed to encode your data. So if you have a series of data, you can encrypt it so that even if someone gets hold of that packet of data, they can't actually see anything useful. It's encrypted using either a public or private key. And again, we'll cover encryption more in detail a little further along. When you look at a network, there's a couple of specific weaknesses that you have to be aware of. The first is simply having a network share that's wide open. So if your developer of R&D has a network share to his My New Projects and it's wide open and it's not limited, that could be a security breach. This could offer a way for someone to get in and see the stuff that's going on in there. One of the biggest problems these days is actually social engineering. What we mean by that is people tend to want to talk. People tend to want to share information. And if you can use social engineering or being able to figure out how people tick, you can get them to tell you things. So if I ask you, hey, we're doing a quiz to come up with what was the mascot in your high school? What was the mascot in your high school? Well, that may be a security question that you may have answered prior to identify yourself. What's your mother's maiden name? These common ones. Most people know those, but remember there's also a lot of other fun ones like what's your favorite pet's name? You know, if you could just go onto Facebook and look up your pets, you'd be able to find your favorite pet's name. So questions like this with social engineering are allowed to get in and get people to share unintentionally knowledge that they shouldn't be talking about. We can also have obviously open port. So 80 is usually HTTP. So if you have a web server running, you're going to open port 80. You can use your netstat rules to be able to find out which ports are open so that you can make sure only specific ports are open and those are protected. If you open up every port, so if you have lots of ports open, you may have a problem with this. So being able to check your open ports is really an important thing from your network's point of view to see if there's any easy way for somebody to get in. We use the phrase zero configuration or zero conf for network devices that can talk to each other. So it was a standard by IEEE, and we designed the devices to see each other without having an administrator or a DHCP or a DNS actually help. So we didn't want to offer any extra assistance here, so they just worked. Well, that's great because you bring a device in, you plug it in, and it immediately connects to the network, and it's lovely. Problem is, anybody else could come in, plug in a network device, and it would immediately be able to connect to the network. So there's a little less security with your zero configuration devices, but they do make it easier. So we kind of have to balance that. Another type of security breaches are actual attacks. These are people coming from the outside and directly attacking your network. The first is a pretty common one called denial of service or DOS attack. The purpose or the way a DOS attack works is the hacker or the bad guy is going to overload the server by sending tons and tons of false requests. If your server usually gets 50 to 100 requests an hour from all of the people in your network, and suddenly they have 1 million requests in 10 minutes, their server's not going to be able to handle it. It's not going to be prepared for that. So any legitimate requests are not going to be able to go through because there's so many false requests that are just clogging up the entire network. DOS attacks can be reflective, being able to reflect the other sources, amplification, making each traffic source larger and more significant so that the false attacks get more penetration than actual legitimate attacks. We can have distributed DOS or DDoS, which is where multiple machines from multiple locations are all attacking at the same time. We can have what we call a Smurf attack, which uses IP spoofing, where we're going to pretend to be a different IP address, and then use the ICMP to be able to fill up the entire target network. Imagine a bunch of little blue Smurfs jumping in and attacking poor Gargamel, assuming you remember who I'm talking about. Even though they're little, they make a big difference. So even though your ICMP protocols are pretty small, if there are tons and tons of them, they attack by having large amounts of little attacks. We can also do a DHCP starvation, which is where when you set up your DHCP server, you have a pool of possible IP addresses. If you only expect to need, say, 75, you might limit your pool to 100 IP addresses. DHCP starvation goes in and it tries to ask the pool for more and more IP addresses until all of the IP addresses in the pool are used by the attacker and none of the legitimate people can actually get one. Because you purposely set your pool to a small amount so that it wouldn't be overrun, nobody's actually allowed to get a DHCP address because they've all been used by the attacker. So these are different types of DOS attacks. We also have what we call a man in the middle, and this comes out a lot in any situation where somebody can come in, they can figure out what the transmission was. So they actually do an interception of your transmission. They read it, they look at it, they analyze it, and they do one of two things. Either they immediately send it on to its destination and absolutely no one's the wiser, but now they have all of your information. Or they can do a replay attack where they can take the information that identified who the sender was and use it to pretend to be the original sender. So then they can send additional information to the destination pretending to be the sender. This is one of those where if you purchase an item and the man in the middle can come in and say, okay, I'm the same user who just purchased it. I'd like to cancel that, then absorb your credit card information and charge it back to themselves. So allow them to receive your money. When you call the original destination and you say, hey, where's my product that I purchased? They're like, you deleted it. You canceled it. You're like, no, I didn't. Yes, you did, because here on this date, the man in the middle came in essentially and said he was you and told us to cancel it. So different options for a man in the middle attack. Anything that, the problem with the man in the middle, the hardest part about it is you usually don't know. You don't have a clue that it occurred. All that happens is you're identifying the information, whether it be your credit card or your personal information or trade secrets. It was breached and security was compromised at that point, but you didn't know because there was no actual telltale signs. There's no evidence of that, except that the guy in the middle has your information now. We also have the option of spoofing. So spoofing is generally the concept of fooling your destination by pretending to be a different IP address. So in the example down here, we have the IP address at the 201 network. He pretends to be at the 126 network, goes across the internet, and tries to connect into the server. If that destination address is able to break through the firewall and get into the server because it's yours and you told it to, he is able to now use that spoofing to be able to get into the server or whatever secure information he needed to get. One of the most common ideas of security breaches are what we think of as malware, or some semblance of software with malicious purposes. Malicious software, malware. So we start with the basic Trojan horse. So go back to Greek mythology. The Trojan horse came in, pretended to be this nice, wonderful thing, and then the bad guys came out of the horse and attacked. This is how the Trojan horse is designed. It's a program pretending to be something nice. Generally, if you go to any of those sites to download free games may have extra malware in the basis of a Trojan horse installed with them. They're pretending to be something that you want. You go ahead and install them, and then they actually are designed to turn around, gain access, build a backdoor so that the hacker can come in through the backdoor. Backdoors are very important to understand. Backdoor is a piece of software that allows the attacker to be able to essentially avoid any authentication or administration rules limiting who can go in. So if you can build a backdoor, you don't need to have a name and a password to be able to get in. You just go straight in through the back door, and it may be a series of keystrokes. It may be a specific name and password that is only known to the attacker, but essentially it avoids any other options for security that you may have implemented. The thing with backdoors as well is that because they don't go through the normal channels, they usually are not auditable. So they don't build a log that says Johnny broke in through the back door. That doesn't happen. Nobody's looking there. So those are really hard to identify and really hard to be able to prove somebody went through the back door and changed this. All I have is that the file is changed, but I have no administration or error logs or event logs to be able to prove it. So Trojan horses generally are going to build a backdoor by pretending to be something else. With your virus, a basic virus, just like the flu, is software that self-replicates. It infects other pieces of software, other computers. You can do two different types. You can do lots of viruses, but two different types that we talk about here is a macro virus. If you go into any word processing system, there's really cool little things that we call macros. And they make it where if you have a series of keystrokes that you use frequently, I'm always typing my name and I'm always putting in the signature the way I want, or I'm always doing a series of keystrokes to be able to save and then change file names or do something different. You can create what's called a macro, and it allows you to monitor keystrokes. And if the user types in the exact subset of keystrokes, something occurs. We use it a lot in programming, where we have, like, if I want to format my document, I can do Control-KF, and it'll format my document. Little keystrokes like this are done through macros. Macros are exceedingly easy to build, and you can make a macro program that's sent via an email, and then it's launched if the user opens the attachment. So the user receives an email, hey, this is mom, everything's great, go ahead and click this link, it's really funny. Okay, my mom sends those all the time. Little does she know they actually are funny, and those are fine. But I'm very, very careful about clicking any link that ever comes in an email. Usually I'll go and try to search for the link directly if it's a news article or something like that. Because it's very easy with those links. You click it, it runs a macro program, which then says, okay, so now you need to log into your email again. Can you type in your password, please? And then it's going to keystroke capture your password and send it back to the original hacker. That's how macro viruses can work. Stealth viruses, similar to Trojans, are viruses that are completely undetected by antivirus software. So we have antivirus software that is designed to recognize all of these viruses. And yet, some viruses haven't been found yet because they were just built yesterday and the virus software doesn't know them yet. So if the virus software doesn't know them yet, we call them a stealth virus. They can get under the virus, the antivirus software, by going undetected. By the way, there's a 0-day concept with viruses where if the virus has not been available for antivirus software, it hasn't been identified, it's usually in the 0-day section where it hasn't been identified by anything. None of the virus software knows how to handle it until it becomes more aware and people figure it out. That's why you have to update your virus software so often, because your virus software is constantly getting new viruses that it needs to check for. Worms are rapidly spreading viruses. They're still viruses. They still self-replicate. They just go really, really fast. So worms are generally rapidly spreading viruses. Ransomware, as the name implies, it's something bad is going to occur. Usually starts as a worm that spreads a virus. But what it does is it pops up and it goes, hey, I've taken over your computer. Send me $50,000 and I'll give it back. The saddest thing about this is that lots of companies actually pay the ransomware to get it resolved. They turn it into a transaction, and it's part of their operating budget is to assume that I need to have some money set aside for ransomware when it comes in. Preventing ransomware from occurring is always the best way to handle this. In most cases, if you get a screen that pops up on your computer that says, call this number now and pay us $250 to be able to fix it, shut off your computer. Disconnect from the internet, do some sort of safe mode to make sure that the user hasn't done anything. In a lot of cases, personal ransomware, so not big business ransomware, but personal on your computer, they'll say that your computer has now been hacked and is now whatever, and you need to pay us to solve this. Or they may just say, call this number. Don't ever call the number. What happens when you call the number is you get their software. They will say, would you please tell us your IP address? They'll type in, try to break in. They'll say, it's going to pop up and say, give us access. Go ahead and say yes. Again, with that social engineering, most people click the yes button. Once they have access to your computer, they can choose to either move things around or change things or install software. In all honesty, what a lot of them do is just do a lot of flash and mirrors, pretending that they're doing a lot of work when they're not actually doing anything, because that's illegal. And then they ask you for $250 for their time. You pay them, they go on with their lives. They didn't actually break any laws and they didn't do anything, but you paid them for their time, so no laws were technically broken here. This is how some ransomwares are going to get people who are not aware that this is what occurs. The last one on this page is going to be your logic bomb. These are designed when you want to have a coordinated attack or something like that, where the malicious activity, whatever it may be, usually has some logical condition. It may be a date, it may be a time, it may be a subset of keystrokes, it may be a lot of different things. It may be saving of a file or changing a file or adding a file. Anything like this, maybe turning off the computer, turning on the computer, can prompt that logic bomb. So a logical condition has occurred. It is now 2:13 p.m. Run the malicious activity, and it allows coordinated attacks. Finally, there's a couple of other variations on security breaches. So there's DNS poisoning, where an attacker actually adds fake entries to the DNS table. By doing this, when you try to go to google.com, if you've got a DNS entry that says send it to this guy's email address or this guy's website instead, then it's going to go over there with your DNS. So a specific email or a website entry so that you go to a different location using the DNS table rather than, when typing in the IP address, you type in the DNS. Same thing with ARP poisoning. You can do the ARP tables and then you spoof your responses to the ARP tables, doing the same type of concept. You can poison your ARP tables so that people go to the wrong address. The evil twin, which I always thought was a fun name, is when you actually add a wireless access point pretending to exist on the existing network. These can be used for both denial of service and man in the middle, specifically man in the middle. Imagine walking into an office, finding a random plugging in a wireless access point, which is going to look around, figure out the other access points, and broadcast his name. If somebody logs into him instead of into their original wireless access point, he can now do man-in-the-middle attacks and forward the requests on just fine without it being noticed or without anybody finding out. So they pretend to be a wireless access point in the network when they actually aren't. You can de-authenticate, which is where you would go in and you would actually remove authentications for specific clients at the source level. So if I said, please always allow Cheryl to have access to this, you could go into the server and say, don't let Cheryl have access. So remove your ability to authenticate. Basic phishing uses emails to steal the identity or sensitive data. This is, again, I'm phishing for information, kind of like phishing for compliments. We're going to go phishing. So we're going to say, hey, this is definitely something that you feel like sharing with me. These are a lot of those Facebook quizzes, what type of personality are you? What are you going to be doing in 2021? What are the different this and that and the other? Those are just phishing for information about you. The more information they have about you, whether it's personal or sensitive, which one of your children is the favorite? Oh, so now I know your children's names. Things like this. So phishing to find information. Insider threat is kind of one of those all-encompassing. Most of the time, when insiders screw up, they actually do it on accident. They're not doing it on purpose. They click the wrong set of things. They accidentally delete something. They accidentally send something. They click on something they're not supposed to do. Most of it is user error. However, there is the intentional malicious activity that comes from users. This is usually when someone gets fired or is about to be fired or is ticked off at management and they really want to do something nasty. So you can have intentional malicious activity from insiders. So essentially an employee who is probably on the rolls to getting fired may go in and add a worm or add a virus to the software to break something because he's mad. People do this. This is the insider problem that you have. One reason as an employer you want to go out of your way to make sure your employees are happy is to avoid things like insider threats. And the last one for this is your basic brute force. It doesn't take that long for a computer to calculate all of the words in the dictionary and just run through them. And it doesn't take that long for them to run through multiple pins. They're only four numbers. It's not that many options. So a brute force attack is just using various passcodes or pin numbers until one of them works. This is one of the reasons why when you do your security, if you have 3 unauthorized attacks, you might get locked down. The brute force attacks are the reason for that because people can write software programs that are going to allow them to run through hundreds of thousands of iterations. Every one of your children's names, every one of your birth dates, flipped, reversed, so on and so forth. You get through the first 20 or 30 of them and you might actually hit pay dirt and get a password that works. At this point, we're going to discuss your intrusion detection and intrusion prevention. Detection, as the name implies, IDS, intrusion detection system, is a passive system. The point is not to actually do anything about the unauthorized activity, but just to let you know, to detect it. Hey, somebody broke in. Somebody else go fix it. I'm not going to do anything about it. Somebody just broke in. I'm just letting you know. So detections only detect unauthorized activity. Prevention systems, they react. So prevention systems are going to both detect, they're going to try to prevent, and they are going to try to remove your malware. So these are a lot of your virus checkers or things that are designed to actually prevent and remove any malware that comes in. Port monitoring can be set up on specific ports. Remember how I said you want to only limit which ports are available to the outside world. You want to add port monitoring on those ports just so it keeps an eye on it. It's monitored through an IDS and it just says, look at port 80, keep an eye on it, see how much traffic comes through here, see what that traffic says, and let's do some monitoring on what the data is that's going through that port. The honeypot concept is designed as a fake system that looks attractive. So what the feds do is they create systems that are designed to look really easy for piracy. So being able to go in and pirate movies. Hey, here's free movies, all first run, free software. Anything that looks too good to be true generally is. So they're usually fake systems that look really, really easy to break for an attacker. The attacker is going to go in there and he's going to try to find his way in there. There's no actual data. There's nothing lost because it's designed that way. But now the feds, or whoever it is that's designing the honeypot, can now see that the attacker tried to attack. They can watch how the attack was done. They can prepare for it better. So a lot of these sites are designed to learn from attackers by watching them actually attack honeypots. At this point, we're going to start talking about different protocols and security methods that we're going to be using. There's a lot of information in the next couple of slides. So if you need to pause, if you need to think about it, if you need to read the book, please feel free. Cryptography. If you do not have any experience with cryptography, you may want to get some. You may want to understand a little bit more about cryptography. Basic cryptography is going to be the study of encrypting or learning how things are modified from plain text into something encrypted so that it cannot be understood by just reading it. We have two different types of encryption that we use, symmetric key and asymmetric key. So with symmetric key, it's a secret key encryption. The same key is used by both people, both parties, they have the same key. It's symmetric, it's the same key. These are your DES, your AES, and your blowfish. So DES is the oldest modern symmetric cipher from 1976. Okay, oldest is really, really relative in this. So oldest modern, we could say, in the last 50 years. It intentionally uses 56-bit keys to encrypt a 64-bit block. There's a variation of it that's 3 DES, which is one of the advanced ones of that. So that's your basic DES. We don't usually use this anymore. We replaced it with AES, which is Advanced Encryption Standard, Advanced AES. And this is pretty much the common one that is used by most people. It uses 128-bit blocks with keys that vary in length from 128, 192, up to 256. So your AES with 256-bit encryption is the current one for top secret and most things that we need to keep encrypted. It's going to take a while for those to get unencrypted by brute force. So your AES Advanced Encryption Standard with 128-bit or 256-bit encryption is the one that you're going to want to use if given the option. Blowfish was designed by Bruce Schneider in 1993, and it uses a variable length key. So it sometimes is a key of like 32 bits and it goes up to 448 bits. It varies, so it's never constant. He built this as open source, released it entirely with no patent and no copyright. Intentionally, it's open source. Anybody can use this, and you don't have to worry about patents or copyrights or anybody really understanding what's going on. It's open source. Again, open source means it's open source, so it can be read and analyzed for problems with it or for any vulnerabilities. So that's basic. Symmetric. They use the same key. Find the key, you're good. Asymmetric encryption is going to be having two different keys. You are going to have a public key and a private key. It is asymmetric. So using a public key and a private key, I can use my private key to encrypt it, and the public key can unencrypt it. You can use the public key to encrypt it, and only the private key is used to unencrypt it. So the encryption is based on which key you have. The two different types of asymmetric key are RSA and Diffie-Hellman. So RSA is probably the most common asymmetric cipher. It's the one that most people are going to use if they're going to do an asymmetric cipher. The letters, I would love to tell you that it's an acronym that you can remember. They're not. They're the letters of the first names of the guys who wrote it. So Rivest, Shamir, and Aldama were the three guys in 1977 that built RSA, and they named it after themselves. So it mathematically factors large numbers to develop the encryption keys, which are very, very difficult to decrypt, because once you get into larger numbers, factoring becomes much harder. Diffie-Hellman, again, named after the two guys who built it, allowed the sharing of keys over insecure channels. So the thing about Diffie-Hellman was that you didn't have to worry about the insecurity of the keys, because you could share them across insecure channels and the other person on the other side wouldn't be able to actually decrypt it. So that again was another one of those that is an asymmetric cipher that allows sharing of keys over the internet. Always fun when people name their protocols after themselves because it makes it harder to remember the acronyms, unless you can remember the guys who wrote it. The other security measure we're covering at this point is our certificate authentication. This creates an actual list of authorized users for whatever the authorization is. That certificate is controlled by a company, a security company, for instance, DigiCert, one of the largest digital certificate companies. You can have a private key owner, and then you can have public key users. And each one of those users, when they sign the certificate, is allowing them or putting them on the list of allowed people who are allowed to use this certificate to prove authentication. Protocols. Lots of protocols on this one. So obviously, when we use security, we're going to be doing different types of security at different points in keeping things safe. First, we talk with the most common one, which is HTTPS. So Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure uses authentication of your clients to encrypt your data using web servers. It is all web server based. HTTPS works at the application layer. So remember our list of layers, application layer, layer 7, is where HTTP works because it's sitting on the application itself, running all of its protocols at that level. So the authentication is done at the application level for HTTPS. It uses public key encryption, and it uses the two different security options of secure sockets layer or transport layer security. Transport layer security is technically the IEFT or the TF, the Internet Engineering Task Force. They come up a lot in this chapter. The Internet Engineering Task Force, who came together and made the security protocol. Technically, you can choose to use either SSL, Secure Sockets Layer, or Transport Layer Security with your security for your website, for your web server. They're not compatible, so you have to pick one or the other. One or the other, but not both, just to secure your websites. Some organizations have claimed that TLS is technically more secure, but SSL has been around longer, so most people still use it because it's the one that they use. So you kind of go back and forth between SSL and TLS. TLS had some recent problems because they deprecated their 1.0 and 1.1 versions, but a lot of sites that were built 10, 15 years ago were still using those versions. So suddenly in mid-August of 2020, a lot of sites started saying, hey, we're no longer secure because TLS is still 1.1 instead of being upgraded to 1.2. Another way that we use security protocols is basically a virtual network connection. This is just the generic concept of being able to connect between a device and a remote device. So there's lots of different ways to do that. With our secure shell, so our SSH, so secure S, shell, SH, SSH, is a more secure network service over an insecure network. Remember back to our Diffie-Hellman about insecure networks? We talk about internet as an insecure network because you can't control everybody who's on the internet, obviously. So SSH allows you to have a secure network service over an insecure network. This was originally designed to replace all of the R commands related to security in Unix. So in Unix, we had the remote login, which was an R login, our remote shell, which was our SH, remember that shell, R shell, and our remote copy, which was file copy. So these were the R commands in Linux or in Unix that were replaced by SSH. All of those now are incorporated in your SSH, your secure shell. This works with a TCP/IP on port 22. Remember when we talked about the different ports for the different protocols? TCP/IP on port 22 is going to handle your secure shell commands. IPsec, or Internet Protocol Security. We talked about this with Voice over IP last time. IPsec actually provides both end-to-end security for both public and private networks. It is the standard that most things are going to use for VPNs or firewalls or any type of authentication software. IPsec uses hashing. If you don't know what hashing is, I recommend a real quick Google search to figure out what hashing is. But it's a mathematical algorithm that is going to take your piece of clear text information and hash it, make it into something that's completely illegible, but can be mathematically undone. So it can be hashed. So it uses mathematical algorithms in hashing. There are different modes with IPsec. You can either use transport mode or tunnel mode. Transport mode means I don't care if you transmit the header. The header is not important when it comes to security. Go ahead and send it, which means we only have to encrypt the data. We don't have to encrypt the header. Tunnel mode encapsulates, remember when we think tunnel, think of encapsulation, the entire packet, both the header and the data. And we've encrypted both of them together in tunnel mode. Requires a little bit more effort to figure out what's going on, but it allows both the header and the data to be encrypted. Couple of different security technologies that use IPsec. The two that we're going to refer to here is the encapsulated security payload, ESP, and the authentication header, which is AH. Both of these are different ways of being able to use IPsec securely. IPsec is also at the network layer. Remember we talked about HTTPS being at the application layer? IPsec is at the network layer. It's down at 3. And it's doing all of its work there because it's actually dealing with packets and it's actually dealing with things on the network at that point. The last one here is your secure copy protocol. This is your secure version of FTP. But this secure copy protocol, which is a secure way to transfer using between computers, similar to your remote copy from Linux or from Unix, it's similar more to anonymous FTP because it doesn't technically require a password. It just makes sure that whoever it was that logged in was able to copy over the data to wherever they were supposed to go into. But it's also an anonymous FTP in that it doesn't store passwords and deal with authentication in that way. Your wireless access point is the most important part of your wireless security. So you have your wireless security, which means you have a wireless access point at some point. You need your SSID to identify your network. We have MAC filters in a wireless access point that allow the wireless access point to restrict by MAC address, so only specific MAC addresses can get in. This is a great way to control that nobody else is getting into your network except the MAC addresses that you have allowed. So you can do both blacklists and whitelists. So lists that will either say only these people are allowed or specifically these people are not allowed. So blacklists or whitelists is how we define those. There's a concept called ward driving. Literally driving around networks or driving around neighborhoods, driving around locations, looking for an insecure network. When you find an insecure network, you can install your worm, you can install viruses, you can install macro viruses so that you can deal with keystrokes, people logging in. This is why you don't do banking over your Starbucks internet, because in theory, that internet could be compromised by a war driver. And literally, they sit in cars outside of networks, hacking into them. The 802.11i standard. There was an 802.11 standard. The 802.11i standard uses the 128-bit AES encryption. It also switches its keys to make sure that they are more secure. So we have our key switching and our AES encryption when we do the 802.11i standard. The 3 different types of security that you can choose when you are doing your wireless security. So we start with our WEP, or our wired equivalent privacy, or protocol, excuse me. Our wired equivalent protocol was designed to be as secure as a wired was when we introduced wireless security. We've already introduced these to you, so these should be repetition of concepts we've already covered. We don't use WEP anymore. It was the first attempt at this. It's fine for home networks that are not under a huge amount of risk, but if you're doing anything with a business, you do not want to use WEP for anything. Your WPA, which is your Wi-Fi protected access, uses TKIP. TKIP stands for Temporal Key Integrity Protocol. Temporal key meaning the key switches. It changes keys frequently to make sure that the protocol stays with the correct key. It was designed to replace WEP or WEP. The last one and the most common and the most secure at this point is WPA2. So our Wi-Fi protected access version 2, the advanced version. It uses a concept called CCNP, which is currently the best alternative of wireless security. CCNP stands for Counter Mode Cipher Block Chaining Message Authentication Code Protocol. And we shortened it down to CCMP. So counter mode cipher, or counter mode cipher block chaining message authentication code protocol. Very long description that describes how it is done. And obviously beyond the scope of this book, but a very interesting protocol, understanding how it is incorporated. When we get into the 802.11 or 802.1x authentication. So this is an authentication protocol. If you ever see the .1x, the 802.1x, that's authentication. This is how are things authenticated. And we'll talk a little bit about authentication and different types of the AAA in a few minutes. So 802.1x authentication provides what we call port-based network access control. Don't think of this as specifically port 80. Port-based is not specific to a specific port. It simply defines a port as any location point where I can access. So we call it port-based because it's access-based. You have a port-based network access control. We use them a lot in client servers, and you require three parts: a supplicant, an authenticator, and an authentication server. In the image here, you can kind of see how it attaches you to your wired network. Your supplicant is you, the login from a remote location. Your authenticator is usually your wireless access point that is going to authenticate you. And then your authentication server, which uses Radius, which we'll discuss on the next slide, is going to authenticate you and make sure that you are allowed in. By the way, we have a concept called rogue access points. These are unauthorized wireless access points. We call them rogues. This is, you walk into an office, you find a random plug, you plug in an access point, and it's not authorized to be there. Anything that is not allowed to be there is called a rogue access point. Our AAA. AAA stands for Authentication, Authorization, and Accounting. Important to keep track of the three things. Authentication. Authentication means you are authentic. You are exactly who you said you are. I'm not saying anything about what you can do and what you have done. I just want to know that you are who you say you are. I'm verifying your identity. Authorization means what are you actually allowed to do? So what resources do you have permission to see? What network shares do you have? What accounts can you see? What permissions do you have and are authorized to use? Somebody has given you permission. So when we think of authorization, think of permissions. Accounting, the last A, keeps track of what did you do? What resources did you use? What activity did you have while you were on? So this AAA security standard, or AAA, is going to be the three pieces of information that need to be controlled to make your system secure. There are three different types of systems that are used today. The first is Radius, which is an authentication on a client-server network. It's designed for a client-server network. So there's a server that is going to centrally locate and store your credentials. They're holding on to your credentials. And they use a port authentication standard to be able to have you come in to the chosen port, the port that we're going to use, and authenticate what are you allowed to do. Are you the right user? Are your credentials correct? So that's Radius, and it's a pretty common one that's used. Diameter is generally used for peer-to-peer or two or more devices directly between them. This is common in cell phones because the cell phone needs to talk to the tower, but it really doesn't need to talk to anybody else. So with cell phones, we can use the diameter protocol, and it can be extended to include all of the requirements of AAA. So not only does it do authentication, it also does authorization to figure out what you can do and can keep track of what did you do while you were there. So which messages did you send? Which ones did you attach to? Where is your phone located? So that's using diameter. The last is TACACS Plus, or TACACS, I think. TACACS. I think it's TACACS. Plus. And what this one does is it's kind of an alternative to Radius. So it uses the same concepts as Radius in a couple of things, except as you can see from the chart here, there's a couple of differences. Radius uses UDP, TACACS uses TCP. Radius uses a database. The other one uses a separate database for each of the options. So authentication gets a database, authorization gets a database, accounting gets its own database. Encryption, again, that tunneling versus the entire packet. So tunneling versus transport mode. Radius uses only the password is what they encrypt, whereas the other one uses the entire exchange. They encrypt everything. Using token-based, they both use token-based. So TagX is actually a Cisco product. It's proprietary for Cisco. So you will use this if you are using Cisco servers, Cisco routers, Cisco situations, Cisco networks. You are going to be using this one over Radius. If you're not using Cisco, you're probably going to be using Radius. When we talk about authentication, we talk a lot about two-factor authentication these days, which requires at least two of the following options. So we have type 1, 2, and 3. Type 1 is something you know. This is your PIN number, your passcode. This is sometimes your mother's maiden name or your high school mascot, something you know. Type 2 is something you have, which is your key or your card. Sometimes we use something you have as your cell phone, because the cell phone, we can send a code to your cell phone, so we have something you have. And the third is something that you are. Something you are is your biometrics, your fingerprints, your retinal scans. These are things that are something specific to you that would be very difficult for someone to replicate. In addition to that, we've added a couple of alternatives or additions. The concept of geofencing refers to somewhere you are, limited to a specific location. The only way you can log in is if you are in this specific geolocation. So we can use geolocation software to figure out where you are. And if you are not there, you cannot get in. So we're locating it based on where you are by putting up a fence or a geolocation fence around a location saying that's where you're allowed to get in. The other is something you do. This concept's been around for a while, but it essentially requires an activity that you have to do. This could be having you read something, so it measures your voice inflection. It could be the way that it asks you to type something in. If you are a pianist and you use a keyboard to make noise or to make music, you could have it type in a specific song, and it can analyze how does your keystrokes work with your defined keystroke. The phrase at the bottom, "Hello, my name is Werner Brenner, my name is my passport, verify me," comes from a movie called Secrets with Ben Kingsley and Robert Redford from, mid-80s, early 90s. Totally impossible movie, irrelevant, but really a great movie when it comes to things like encryption software. Again, totally implausible, never going to happen, but it was really kind of a fun show. Couple of the protocols that we need to understand about how things are authenticated. So first we start with our password authentication protocol, our PAP. PAP is completely obsolete. I am telling you just for historical basis. It's the basic technique that we used for HTTP or remote dial-up, and everything is sent in clear text and compared to a database. So you type in a username and password, they go across the internet in clear text, they get to the other side, they check it against a database and say you're good. This is when security was not an issue and we didn't worry about things. We then created the Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol, or CHAP. This encrypts the username and password, sends it across, and compares it against unencrypts it and compares it against the database once it gets to the server safely. Microsoft's version, or MS CHAP, also encrypts the package itself, uses the PPP, point-to-point protocol. Kerberos came out and gave us the MIT-developed system that allows computers to communicate over the insecure network. You've heard this phrase about 3 times so far. This is important. So Kerberos was named after Cerberus, depends on how you pronounce it, the 3-headed dog that guards the entrance to the underworld in Hades in Greek mythology. The purpose of it, the MIT grads, they're also, history buffs, got really into the Greek mythology and named it Kerberos as a way of protecting 3-headed for authentication, administration, and authorization. So 3 heads, Kerberos being 3-headed dog. So Kerberos is designed to not send the encrypted passwords at all. It doesn't send them across the internet. What it does is it will send the email address or the user login to the server. The server will take the expected password, hash together in a hash value that is in no way able to be unencrypted without the software, and sends that back to the client. The client then is able to do the hash comparison with their password without having to send the password directly over the internet, which is great because that way you don't have to worry about the internet being insecure. The last protocol we're going to refer to is the Extensible Authentication Protocol, or the EAP. This is the standard, again, that Internet Task Force standard when IP is not available. If we can't do IP, we can actually use a phone line to build a PPP, point-to-point connection. Two different types of Extensible Authentication Protocol. We have our PEEP, our Protected EAP, which is a Cisco and Microsoft product, or our LEAP, which is our lightweight Extensible Authentication Protocol. This is Cisco's version for their wireless access points. So wireless access points are going to use the LEAP protocol to be able to do their authentication protocol. Couple of quick comments on trying to make your system as secure as possible. First and most important, always install the patches to your software. Your software is going to provide patches that are going to be designed to clean up holes or vulnerabilities in the software. If you implement the patches, they essentially have said, we found this vulnerability and this is how you fix it. Don't worry about implementing your patches. They usually do not break things. They do sometimes, so be prepared, do backups, prepare for that. But in general, you need to install your patches. Obviously have administrator accounts where specific accounts have administrator access and other people don't. Limit, do not give everybody in your network full control of the entire network. Device hardening is the concept of being able to make it as secure as possible. What can we do to make the device as secure as possible? And the last one, of course, is your user account passwords. This is going to be a problem anywhere. How do you make your password easy to remember for the user and hard for a hacker to track? If you pick something that's easy for the user to remember, it is probably easy for the hacker to break. So you have to come up with different ways to do it. The rules that we tend to use now involve using phrases as opposed to passwords, trying to make it as hard as possible to hash or to guess. Keeping track of history, you can't use the same password in case it was caught. Changing your password frequently means that they can't get in the next time. Password ages limit how long the password is allowed to be valid. Sometimes a month, sometimes 6 months, sometimes a week. Depends on how secure you need to keep it. And minimum password length. The longer the length is, the harder it is to brute force crack. There's a list here of just some easy ones. I'm going to make my password. I'm going to do ABC. I'm going to do 1, 2, 3. Don't do things like that. Using some words, a series of words to make a phrase, using some special characters, using something that means something to you, and switching out letters for numbers, numbers for letters as necessary to make it even that much harder to guess. Okay, quick section on firewalls. So firewalls, which are actually kind of incorporated in the book in the middle of the security options, are really, really important. The firewall is designed to monitor and or block packets as they enter or leave the network. So they allow certain packets to go through, certain packets don't. So that's the point of the firewall. And you can see from the imagery here, we have some authorized and some unauthorized. They go through the internet, they hit the firewall. The firewall should stop any of the unauthorized from going through. The authorized should be allowed to go wherever it wants to. And then things on the other side of the firewall are inside your LAN. They are already secure. Your firewall has a packet filter. It looks at packets as they pass through the firewall, and there are two different ways that you can do packet filtering: stateless and stateful. Stateless means that every packet is looked at individually, irregardless of any packet that came before or after it. Everything is individual. This is kind of like flipping a coin, and the previous coin flips have no bearing on whether or not the coin is going to be heads or tails. In a stateless, there is no state stored, so it's stateless, so that there is no concept of what happened before and after. Each packet is looked at individually. Stateful looks at a series of packets. It tries to identify trends, missing packets, looks around to figure out if multiple packets were identical or if multiple packets were different. Dynamically inspects, so it looks at things differently. Stateless works directly at layer 3, whereas stateful looks at both layer 3 and layer 4 to try to figure this out. It takes more time, it's slower, and it takes more bandwidth as opposed to the fast stateless, but it is also more secure. We have application gateways, which are gateways designed for a specific application. FTP, Telnet, whatever the application is, your voice over IP, your Teams, your Skype, we can have a gateway designed just for that application, which is designed to implement its security. Content filter is going to look for specific content, specific websites or specific words, specific terms. If there are terms that are more of a risk, those can be blocked. Circuit level gateway monitors the actual connection until it's securely established. So when you go to do a connection, your circuit level gateway can look through and say, we're going to keep an eye on this until everything is established and we're sure that it's secure. And it just monitors that connection to make sure that it's secure. Your firewall signature identification. This is similar to your antivirus program for your firewall. It sets up and it keeps track of, these are things that I'm expecting are going to be bad. Just ignore them completely, block them. These are allowed to go through. Keeps track of kind of like an antivirus, your firewall signature. The last is what we call the DMZ, or the demilitarized zone. Yes, taken from military. It's the area that is segregated out to permit access to outside users. The internal network is completely segregated from the DMZ. And the DMZ allows you to log in from the outside world, from the internet, into the DMZ without having any direct correlation between it and the actual LAN itself. This would be for public information that you're not worried about authentication in. So we can have public servers there, whereas the private, more important things are left over in the LAN. Couple of more security options before we go into different tools. Our unified threat management just means that it combines all of the security technology together into one program. So unified. It's all of our threat management systems all incorporated into one system. Our layer 7 firewall, remember our firewalls usually work at the lower levels. The layer 7 firewall allows it to work at the higher levels, up at the application level. Proxy servers. Proxy servers are components of the firewall that actually hide the address of the true host either direction. It replaces the IP address on all outgoing packets and incoming packets. You can income them to the proxy, and then the proxy will send them off to where they belong. Proxy servers can be a problem if your network is insecure in that a virus has gone in and added a proxy server. That would mean that the IP addresses are going to be changed. Making sure your remote access is secure, and obviously physical security. Put a lock on the door of your server room, whether that lock is biometric or security card or just an actual physical key. Putting a lock on the door adds the physical security of limiting who is allowed in the server room. All right, some of the security tools. We've talked about a few of these before. So our NetStat will tell you which ports are open. You need to know which ports are open so you can know which ones to close. Our audit tools, the point of audit tools is to allow you to recognize event viewers and login failures so that you know if you're being hacked, so you know what's going on with your server. There is a tool called GFI LandGuard, which is a kind of self-hack tool that allows you to go in and hack your network, look at your network and see where the vulnerabilities are. Protocol analyzers and packet sniffers. Okay. A packet sniffer captures packets as they travel through the network and looks at the individual packets. Protocol analyzer, like Wireshark, does packet sniffing and protocol. So it looks at the different, inspects the frames, looks at the packet contents similar to a packet sniffer, but it also allows some visual tools to allow you to look at individual protocols and the different layers. Obviously, do system backups. That's kind of a guaranteed. And make sure you have policies in place to handle situations that may occur in your offices. The last little section, yes, you made it to the end, is a couple of data security compliance requirements. Depending on what industry you are working in, some are standards, some are laws, some are actually required. Difference between standards and laws. Standards are voluntary. You can choose to follow them, you can choose not to follow them, totally up to you. Recommend that you do, and some contracts may be not awarded if you don't follow the standards, but in general, standards are voluntary. Laws are required. They are legally binding. People go to jail for breaking laws. So 2 of the things that we reference here is our HIPAA and our PCI. So HIPAA is the Health Insurance Portability Accountability Act. This was designed to allow hospital records, patient records, to be able to send from doctor to doctor over the internet. Before this was implemented, if you had a patient record at your doctor and you wanted to send it to a new doctor, they would have to actively pack up paper and mail it, because that's so much more secure, to the new doctor rather than sending it over the internet, because the implication is that the internet was not going to be secure. The HIPAA program was designed specifically to protect those health records, to keep things secure and encrypted when sending information over the internet and or when sending information in any situation between protocols or between doctors and medical establishments. Your payment card industry data security standard, payment card, this is your credit cards. Keeping the set of credit card standards to make sure that when you're using Visa or MasterCard or Discover or American Express, that those standards, when sending over the internet, using digital, that those are implemented correctly. You want to make sure that your credit card company implements the payment card industry data security standards so that when you do use your credit card, it is done securely and everything is kept safe. All right, for Chapter 15, lots of review questions if you choose to do them. Again, optional. Study guide, there's 18 sections as you would expect with this long of a chapter. For the lab activities, 70 through 77, so there's 8 of those. Most of the labs will just use your normal computer with internet access. Some of them will request that you manipulate your firewall and or your security options. You are allowed, obviously, to change those, but you do not have to if you understand what you're doing and you want to be careful about it. So if you do not want to, I still recommend that you read through the procedures and understand what you need to do. If you're comfortable making those changes and then changing them back or even implementing the new changes, that's fine. But at no point are you required to put yourself in a position where you're uncomfortable changing your settings on your computer. So the standing rule for 70 through 77 is do as much of the lab as you can, as you feel comfortable. If you choose to skip parts of the procedure, just list them in the notes section. So say I didn't do steps 5 through 8 because I don't feel comfortable doing that. Lab 71 uses Wireshark using sample files 16 and 17. And make sure you fill out your PDFs and get them submitted. The study mate should be available and the Chapter 15 quiz. Thank you so much for watching this video on network security, Chapter 15. Please come back next time for Chapter 16. Have a great week.